back to our lecture series on literary criticism and theories particularly. And let me remind you what we have been discussing so far. Now, in today's lecture series, we are going to focus on the remaining part that we had continued in the previous lecture. And we are also going to continue with our question answers on the same period particularly. By the way, if you remember in yesterday's session, let us have a brief summarization of what we have been discussing in yesterday's lecture series particularly, right? And in yesterday's lecture continuously we had a brief history of romantic period particularly, exactly, and then we started talking about the Victorian age, right? So learn fast and let's go on discussing about, right? So again, as I stated, let me welcome back you on the period is called literary criticism and theories. Literary criticism and theories particularly, right? So this seems to be one of the interesting topics otherwise, where we are going to focus on few of the other important factors particularly. So it is much more of an importance, right? Within that, we talked about earlier, we have already talked about this very interesting period called romantic period, exactly. So we checked the history, then we talked about some prominent figures from this period very particularly, and we also try to find out various concepts that got evolved in romantic period, right? Now as I stated again that this period itself is nothing but a kind of a movement, exactly, and the reaction of this movement can be notified in a very particular way with that of its reaction can be seen. So as I stated that every historical period in every particular period in history of English literature is a reaction, exactly. So the preceding period creates its a precedenter particularly, right? So who is going to proceed with that, who is going to continue with that matters the most, and in a way this is a kind of a significant factor that we are supposed to take into consideration particularly, right? So as stated previously, every period has its own unique identity, and the various literature that got produced in a particular period makes kind of a greater sense otherwise. And so it is much more important to understand its significance, what various theories got evolved, what were ideas that were got conceived particularly, and how it is nothing but in a way retaliating in a way retaliating action to a previous period particularly, right? So it becomes a part of great concern when we talk about this very particular period, right? So we started with again an interesting period from our chapter, that is Victorian period, right? Now in Victorian period we talked about the background of Victorian period, right? Now the Victorian period, which is remarked by the particular governance of Queen Victoria, which covers particularly the 19th and 20th century literature particularly, right? So this 19th and 20th century literature, which 20th century literature, which made a remarkable impact, particularly what various thoughts got evolved, particularly. So when we try to find out its origins, in yesterday's lecture series only, we have been through that, exactly, and we also have seen the five prominent critics, right? Let's just revise about them and continue with what we have been discussing so far, particularly, right? So this age particularly covers from 1837 to 1901, and it is a period, right? So in yesterday आपण कालच्या लेक्चर मध्ये हे अतिशय समर्पकपणे बघितलं की याचं नेमकं महत्व काय येतं, याचं नेमकं महत्व कसं विचारात केलं जातं, and so this makes a kind of a greater impact on our identification to otherwise to realize the significance of this period in a very particular way, right? So when we try to find out the typical history of this very period, we realize that काल आपण काय काय बघितलं की हे एज म्हणजे काय आहे, एक्झॅक्टली कुठल्या कुठल्या गोष्टींचा फार इम्पॅक्ट होता. आपण बघितलं की सायंटिफिक टेम्परामेंट होतं, इंडस्ट्रियलायझेशन होतं, मेकनायझेशन होतं, एक्झॅक्टली, अँड द ग्रोथ ऑफ ब्रिटिश एम्पायर अक्रॉस द ग्लोब are the several factors that took those were witnessed by this very particular period, right? And definitely the decline of unquestioned religious faith. Now when we try to find out what is exactly the crux of Victorian period, we realize that it is nothing but it is an effect, or it is kind of like a counter effect of the romantic ideas, exactly. जिकडे romantic period मध्ये extreme individualism होतं, इंडिव्हिज्युअल आयडेंटिटीला महत्व होतं, सिम्पल लँग्वेजला महत्व होतं, कॉमन लँग्वेजला महत्व होतं, नॅचरल एलिमेंट्सला महत्व होतं, मोर ऑफ इमॅन्सिपेशन, लिबर्टी वर द सर्टन पार्ट्स दॅट गॉट ग्रेटली प्रोपोगेटेड in romantic period particularly. But in case of identification, in case of understanding various key elements of Victorian period, we have to mark this very particular part that Victorian period मध्ये सगळ्यात जास्त इम्पॅक्टफुल काम किंवा इम्पॅक्टफुल गोष्टी कुठल्या झाल्या असतील तर त्या आहेत. तर त्यामध्ये कुठलं तर इमॅजिनेटिव्ह आयडियलिझम ऑफ रोमॅन्टिक्स अँड द इंटेलेक्च्युअल रिगर ऑफ मॉडर्न्स या दोन्हीचा एक संगम साधून जो एक नवीन जॉनरा तयार केला गेला तो आपण कुठे नोटीस करतो तर तो आपण पर्टिक्युलरली Victorian period मध्ये नोटीस करतो. राईट. So Victorian period has its a great amount of what we can say a kind of a greater amount of contribution particularly. So Victorian era चं महत्व काय आहे? मॉरल कन्सायन्स, मॉरल सिरियसनेस, सोशल कन्सर्न, इंटेलेक्च्युअल क्लॅरिटी या सगळ्या गोष्टींना एक वेगळ्या प्रमाणे महत्व प्राप्त झालं पर्टिक्युलरली की जे टोटली वेगळं होतं. सो विक्टोरियन पिरियड असा आहे की ज्यांनी रोमॅन्टिक मधल्या काही गोष्टी इनहेरिट केल्यात पण स्वतःच्या गोष्टी इव्हॉल्व करत एक मॉडर्न पिरियड जो आहे ना त्या मॉडर्न पिरियडचा प्लॅटफॉर्म तयार केला असं म्हणायला हरकत नाही. राईट. सो इट रिमेन्स अ व्हेरी रिमार्केबल पिरियड इन हिस्ट्री ऑफ इंग्लिश लिटरेचर पर्टिक्युलरली टू अंडरस्टँड अँड हाऊ द क्रिटिसिझम गॉट इव्हॉल्व. राईट. Now, when we try to find out the intellectual background, exactly, there are several major factors that shape the Victorian criticism. Victorian criticism ला शेप करणारे कुठले होते? इंडस्ट्रियलिझम आणि मटेरियलिझम होतं, ज्यामध्ये मेकनायझेशन ऑफ लाईफ, मॉरल कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोग्रेस हे क्वेश्चन केलं गेलं क्रिटिक्सनी. कारण इंडस्ट्रियल ग्रोथ इंग्लंडमध्ये इतक्या मोठ्या प्रमाणात झाली होती ना की when we try to understand its expansion and its effect on society, we can see there are two different classes that were greatly identified. There was the rich class and there was the poor class particularly, where the one class was longing for various accessories and there was the other class that was greatly blessed with all those accessories and accesses to the various luxuries of life which were greatly and abundantly available for them. अशा दोन टोकाचे क्लास यामध्ये निर्माण झाले होते. एक्झॅक्टली. आणि त्यामुळे क्रिटिक्सनी मग प्रोग्रेस, वी हॅव मेड अ प्रोग्रेस बट ॲट व्हॉट कॉस्ट अशा प्रकारचं एक काम त्या ठिकाणी केलेलं दिसतं. वेन वी ट्राय टू अंडरस्टँड द रोल ऑफ क्रिटिक्स पर्टिक्युलरली, एक्झॅक्टली दॅट द रोल ऑफ क्रिटिक्स वॉज नॉट जस्ट ओनली लिमिटेड टू क्रिटिसिझम. राईट. अनालिसिस ऑफ टेक्स्ट या पुरताच मर्यादित राहिलेला नव्हता. राईट. आपण ते पण बघितलं. दुसरं कुठलं बघितलं? सायन्स अँड पॉझिटिव्हिझम. एक्झॅक्टली. याच काळामध्ये डार्विनने त्याची इव्होल्युशन थेअरी मांडली, एक्झॅक्टली स्पेशीज बद्दलची. एक्झॅक्टली. त्यामुळे सायंटिफिक परस्यूटला खूप व्हॅल्यू आली होती. सायंटिफिक ॲटिट्यूड किंवा सायंटिफिक टेम्परामेंट in a way we can see greatly making an impact on the criticism of that Victorian period, right? And so its traditional beliefs got shook and definitely the rationalism was somewhere got introduced instead of the blind beliefs and blind faiths. हा एक त्यामागचा सगळ्यात मोठा फॅक्टर आहे. राईट. अँड सो द न्यू मॉरल फाउंडेशन टू रिप्लेस द वेनिंग अथॉरिटी ऑफ religion could be noticed in this very particular period. Right. And so it is of a much more importance to understand its significance otherwise. Right. Then democratization of education. Right. The growth of literary and proliferation magazines reviews. Exactly. मग त्या काळात वेगवेगळे मॅगझिन्स शिकलेल्या. ओके. आता अजूनही जेव्हा आपण विक्टोरियन एराबद्दल बोलतो ना खरं तर या एरामध्ये अजूनही वुमन एज्युकेशन किंवा फिमेल एज्युकेशनला फार तितकं प्रोग्रेस नाही मिळाली किंवा अजूनही विमन एज्युकेशनची एक स्वतंत्र ब्रांच किंवा त्याला एक वेगळा दर्जा असा या काळामध्ये we do not notice such a kind of a thing particularly, but yet we realize that in a way the progress that made in education, it gave a literary criticism a wider audience otherwise. Right. The things that were written and produced greatly got widespread exactly due to the industrial revolution. त्यामुळे ट्रान्सपोर्टेशनची साधनं वाढली होती, प्रवासाची साधनं वाढली होती, वाहतुकीची साधनं वाढली होती, ड्यू टू विच वी रिअलाइज दॅट थिंग्स गॉट स्प्रेड व्हेरी इझिली अँड फास्टली. खूप सहज आणि अतिशय गतिमान वेगाने त्या गोष्टी सर्व दूर पसरायला लागल्या आणि त्यामुळे एक वाईड रेंज ऑफ ऑडियन्स द क्रिटिसिझम अँड लिटरेचर दॅट गॉट प्रोड्यूस हॅड रिसिव्ड. एक्झॅक्टली. सो जे काही लिटररी टेक्स्ट प्रोड्यूस केले गेले होते त्याला एक मोठ्या प्रमाणात असा एक चांगला ऑडियन्स मिळाला असं आपण या ठिकाणी म्हणू शकतो. त्यामुळे तो एक इम्पॅक्ट या ठिकाणी बघून येतो. Exactly. And the last one impact that we have seen with us is the impact of romantic inheritance or romantic legacy. Right. So the Victorian critics inherited from Wordsworth and Coleridge the sense that poetry expresses the deepest truth of human life, but unlike romantics who celebrated individual emotion, Victorians emphasized social duty and cultural order. Exactly. Victorian era ची सगळ्यात मोठी खासियत आहे का moral concern, ethical society. Exactly. Ethical society, moral concern, duties, laws, orders. Exactly. So, and the preservance or the preserving culture. Exactly. And art for the sake of art हा थॉट खूप मोठ्या प्रमाणामध्ये या ठिकाणी व्हिक्टोरियन एरामध्ये आलेला दिसतो. एक्झॅक्टली सुरुवातीला असे काही क्लासिकल क्रिटिक्स डेफिनेटली आहेत की जे फक्त दे से एक्झॅक्टली ओके नाउ व्हेन वी ट्राय टू गो बॅक टू दी previous part of this particular phase, right, in the period of romanticism or in the period of neoclassicism, there was a much of importance to given when the functions of critics were greatly defined. We realized that याचा एक वेगळा इम्पॅक्ट आपल्याला झालेला दिसतो अँड बाय दॅट वी रिअलाइज यातनं काय दिसून येतं तर एक असं दिसून येतं की या पिरियडमध्ये critics were stuck to their critics were restricted to their only limited work, that is of a criticism, that is analysis of text, evaluation of text, interpretation of text and judgments. Exactly, those were the several attributes they were supposed to possess and accordingly assess or do the job of their criticism. What's kind of a thing that was assigned to them particularly in a social way, in an indirect or direct way, which can be stated. सो प्रत्यक्षपणे त्या काळातल्या काही सगळ्या क्रिटिसिझमचं हेच काम होतं. पण व्हिक्टोरियन एजमध्ये क्रिटिसिझमची एक नोशन बदललेली दिसते. क्रिटिसिझम हे फक्त टेक्स्ट अनालिसिस न राहता मॉरल इव्हॅल्युएशन. एक्झॅक्टली the critics became educator, critics become the prophet, critics become the judgmentalist. Exactly, they become the judge of society particularly, and so they become the torch bearer of society where they had to teach the morals. Exactly, and they were of opinion which was now आता हे जे आपण अरिस्टॉटलनी प्लेटोनं मागे जातो ना त्यापर्यंत हे ओपिनियन आपल्याला अगदी स्ट्रॉंगली बघायला मिळतं. म्हणजे काय तर लिटरेचर इज नॉट पर्टिक्युलरली लिमिटेड with the thought of entertainment. Exactly, the primary function of literature is not just to delight but to more of that is to instruct. Exactly, so your literature should literature should be considered as a wheel to spread the moral values, ethical values. Exactly, and certain social rules and regulations, its implementation and its observance. अशा अनेक गोष्टींसाठी लिटरेचरचा इन अ ट्रू सेन्स उपयोग व्हायला हवा. अशा प्रकारचं काहीतरी ओपिनियन आपल्याला या काळामध्ये स्ट्रॉंगली कन्सिव्ह झालेलं आणि इम्प्लिमेंट केलं गेलेलं दिसतं. राईट, अँड दस इट इज मच मोर इम्पॉर्टंट टू अंडरस्टँड which are the prominent figures of critics that have paid a kind of a great amount of contribution in case of making their ideas and the idealism of what we can say Victorian period, or the very specific who have greatly contributed in making the concrete identity of Victorian period as a remarkable period in history of English literature. Thus, their contribution is noteworthy, and we need to find out what various elements were there, taking the NAT and CET examination into our consideration for sure. Right? Let's go and try to understand now what was the kind of a contribution. We are just revising people. We have already seen about 4 of the prominent critics in that period. Right? There are 2 or 3 who are remaining. We'll be discussing about them in detail, and then will we proceed with our next part, that is the question answer series based on this very particular period, that is Victorian age. I have got 50 questions with me. We'll be solving them. There are certain explanations of those questions, and those questions are designed keeping your NAT and CET examination into consideration. Right? Let's proceed now. We have the prominent figure. We talked about Thomas Carlyle and his thoughts. Okay, what Thomas Carlyle was doing, he was considered as the prophet of moral criticism. Exactly, this very concept that got newly emerged is that is criticism with moral purpose, right? So he was a man of moral and spiritual interpreter of life particularly, and according to him, critic of literature, right? He was considered rather than a critic of literature but a moral and spiritual interpreter of life. So he's a criticism that was deeply connected with moral earnestness and a call to restore the spiritual vitality to an industrial society he saw as a mechanized and soulless. Exactly, due to industrial revolution, a lot of people had engaged into materialistic values and possession of materialistic things, where they had forgot to get the true sense of life, which was relying in a culture, according to the contemporary critics. त्या काळातल्या क्रिटिक्सच्या मतानुसार आयुष्याचं खरं भलं किंवा जीवनाचं मूल्य, द व्हॅल्यू ऑफ लाईफ लाईज इन कल्चर अँड आर्ट पर्टिक्युलरली, वेअर ॲज then the society that lacked the taste of culture and art had shifted their focus on materialistic approaches and luxuries that they would enjoy and cherish the most. सो अशा सोसायटीला करेक्ट करण्याचं काम कोणाचं आहे तर क्रिटिक्सचं आहे, असं ओपिनियन थॉमस कार्लाइलचं होतं. राईट, now when we try to focus on his prominent work, Heroes and Heroes Worship, exactly, we find him defining hero as an embodiment of divine energy, right? And so he believed that literature and history should celebrate such heroic figures, particularly poets, prophets and reformers, because they act as the moral guides of humanity, right? And so his criticism is not aesthetic but ethical, and thus we find him who has greatly contributed, exactly, with his style particularly, which is quite rhetoric, which is quite impassioned and prophetic, which reflects the belief the writer is moral leader in an age of doubt. Exactly. So थॉमस कार्लाइलचं आपण काम बघितलं तर तो मोर ऑफ अ मॉरल आणि फिलॉसॉफिकल क्रिटिक वाटतो, माहिती आहे का, की जो सोशल रिफॉर्मरच्या पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने त्याचं क्रिटिसिझम बघतो. लिटररी क्रिटिसिझम असा नाहीये, पण सोशल रिफॉर्मरच्या पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने त्याचं क्रिटिसिझम घेऊन जाताना बघतो. त्यामुळे त्याचे काम फार महत्वाचं आहे. आफ्टर दॅट वी हॅव जॉन रस्किन, एक्झॅक्टली, हू टॉक्ड अबाउट दी मॉरल फंक्शन ऑफ आर्ट. अगदी त्याच्याच रांग म्हणजे कोणाच्या, थॉमस कार्लाइलच्या रांगेतूनच थोडासा पुढे आलेला म्हणजे कोणाचा, तर जॉन रस्किन होता. जॉन रस्किनचं काय म्हणणं आहे ते आपण बघून घेऊया. एक्झॅक्टली, लाईक कार्लाइल ही वॉज अ प्रॉफिट ऑफ मॉरल व्हॅल्यूज, okay, but in his field, art and aesthetic particularly, art and the sense of understanding the beauty of art was kind of a much more importance for him, exactly. And his monumental works are modern painters, then the seven lamps of architecture and the stones of Venice, exactly, where he talked about the three unities: unity of beauty, unity of truth, and unity of morality, exactly. And he was somebody who had a thought that all great art is the expression of moral life, exactly. Whatever great art we produce, it is nothing but the expression of moral life, exactly. And thus he greatly criticized the utilitarian spirit of his age, and he greatly stated that art should reflect the truth to nature, exactly. As I said, the way Carlyle greatly criticized the mechanized or materialistic approach of then contemporary people and their lack of taste for art and culture, a kind of a similar thought or kind of similar ideas can be seen expressed by John Ruskin over here in his criticism particularly, right? And so we find him stating that uh, beauty is much more important. Having a sense to taste the beauty and identify the beauty is quite important, and especially that with art is much more important. Was a kind of a thought can be seen over here, conceived in the mind of John Ruskin particularly, right? And so we can find him extending his aesthetic philosophy into a social one, where he argued that the economic system should serve human well-being, exactly. And so it's the aesthetic movement. So we find him somebody who inspired the aesthetic movement or socialistic thought, exactly. Equality, socialistic thought, and the significance of certain social elements, हा डिस्कशनचा पार्ट थॉमस कार्लाईल नंतर जॉन रस्किन मध्ये खूप दिसतो. त्यानंतर पुढचा आहे म्हणजे कोण, तर मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्ड, हु इज प्रॉमिनंटली कन्सिडर्ड ॲज अ फादर ऑफ English criticism particularly, exactly. And he is considered also the classical ideal of criticism, right? Now when we try to understand his various essays, particularly the functions of criticism at the present time, then Culture and Anarchy, which got greatly famous and is popular in the recent times also, and the last one is the study of poetry, exactly, who talked about the criticism as a discipline with its own principles and purpose, exactly. So विक्टोरियन पिरियडमध्ये क्रिटिसिझमला एक स्ट्रक्चर घेऊन देणारा किंवा एक स्ट्रक्चर मिळवून देणारा किंवा एखाद्याला स्ट्रक्चरमध्ये उभा करणारा असा कुठला क्रिटिक असेल, असा कोणता क्रिटिक असेल, तर तो आहे मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्ड, एक्झॅक्टली. म्हणून त्याने क्रिटिसिझमला एक सेपरेट डिसिप्लिनचा डेझिग्नेशन दिला आणि सांगितलं की या डिसिप्लिनचे सेपरेट प्रिन्सिपल्स आहेत आणि याची एक फंक्शनिंग सिस्टम आहे क्रिटिसिझमची, राईट. मग त्यामध्ये त्यांना पुढे काय काय टाकलं, he talked about the central ideas that can be summarized particularly, exactly. He talked about the function of criticism. He says that criticism must be disinterested. Disinterested means it should be free, it should be, in a way he wanted to say that there has to be a great amount of transparency in the transaction of a critic, exactly. तो कसा हवा, एकदम ट्रान्सपरंट हवा, एक्झॅक्टली. म्हणजे काय, तर कुठल्याही प्रकारचा प्रिज्युडाइज कामाचा नाही, एक्झॅक्टली. Yes, being already possessed with some earlier opinions will definitely make an impact on the process of criticism. So, leaving those possessive thoughts or impacts, preoccupied thoughts, living at the moment you start criticizing matters the most. Okay, dropping them is much necessary. कुठलाही मनात पूर्वग्रह घेऊन, कुठलाही मनात प्रिजुडाइज ठेवून आपण जगू शकत नाही किंवा क्रिटिसिझम होऊ शकत नाही. सो क्रिटिक्स शुड बी डिसइंटरेस्टेड. इन व्हॉट सेन्स? फ्री फ्रॉम पॉलिटिकल, religious and personal prejudice. Exactly. So he also added that the aim of critics should be to see the object as itself it is in reality. जसं आहे तसं बघायचं. जी कविता आहे त्या कवितेला त्या पॉइंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने बघायचं. जसा लेसन आहे तसा लेसनकडे, जसा प्रोज आहे प्रोजकडे, पोएट्री आहे पोएट्रीकडे. अ काइंड ऑफ अ थॉट वी कॅन सी विल स्प्रेड ओव्हर हिअर बाय Matthew Arnold. Then he talked about cultural as a moral ideal. When we try to understand his essay Culture and Anarchy, we find him defining that a study of perfection, so harmonizing exactly, where he refers that culture as a study of perfection, हार्मोनायझिंग ऑफ इंटेलेक्ट अँड कंडक्ट. एक्झॅक्टली तुमचं बुद्धी आणि तुमचं वागणं हे जेव्हा हार्मोनाइज येईल ते होण्यासाठी काय आहे? द स्टडी ऑफ परफेक्शन मॅटर्स द मोस्ट, विच इज प्रोसिडेड विथ द स्टडी ऑफ कल्चर ऑर अंडरस्टँडिंग कल्चर. ज्याला कल्चरल बेस आहे त्याच्यामध्ये हे इंटेलेक्ट आणि बिहेवियरचं हार्मोनायझेशन म्हणजे कॉन्डक्टचं हार्मोनायझेशन झालेलं दिसतं, विच मॅटर्स द मोस्ट अकॉर्डिंग टू हिम. अँड सो ही डिफाईन्स द रोल where he says that culture should save society from chaos of materialism and narrow-mindedness. So somewhere when we try to understand the ideology, we can see a common thread between Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, and now Matthew Arnold too, who says or who greatly criticizes or denounces the materialistic approach of then society that got greatly developed due to the industrialization or advancement in certain technological parts of the society, right? So its denouncement can be greatly seen with Matthew Arnold too. And so when he's a culture and anarchy, we find him giving much of emphasis to culture and how the disconnection from culture has created into greater amount of anarchy or acceptance of a havoc or chaotic life. Exactly, which results into a chaotic life further. That's what he adds, right? So it is much of importance to understand what he has to say over here in this very essay, Culture and Anarchy, right? Now further one we have is considering poetry as a substitute to religion. Exactly, as poetry, as many of them have said, this is a thought particularly inherited by Victorian age critics from particularly by the romantics, that the poetry stands above all art forms particularly, and it is the expression of spiritual soul, right? So it is above, it can be a replacement to religious thoughts particularly. That's what that's what kind of opinion we find Matthew Arnold making over here. What he says that poetry is the highest form of spiritual expression, and so it is a bottom of criticism of life, and so it becomes the moral and aesthetic force. It means to refine human sensibility. The way the religion acts, the same or likely the same poetry does. What kind of opinion or a thought can be seen expressed by Matthew Arnold. And finally, the famous one is about the touchstone of great literature. Exactly, it means uh, referring to the classics particularly, right? Referring to the classical works, referring to the classical ideas is much more important, right? And so we find him referring to that. And so he tells us to refer to Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton, exactly, which says that objective standards of excellence amid the flood of modern mediocrity. Exactly, कवितेच्या नावाखाली, प्रोच्या नावाखाली जे काही भेसळ चालली होती, जे काही लो क्वालिटी लिटरेचर प्रोड्यूस केलं जात होतं, त्या लो क्वालिटी लिटरेचरच्या प्रोडक्शनवरती सिव्हिअर क्रिटिसिझम करण्याचं काम कोणी केलं असेल तर ते मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्डने केले, राईट? And so Matthew Arnold remains one of the prominent figure of this period particularly. Why? Because of his this kind of a quality where he states greatly the significance of referring to the classics, because at least by referring to them you will have an idea. When you produce your work, you refer to the classical works done by, so he asks us to refer to Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton, exactly, are the prominent figures who have ruined, exactly, who have ruled their who had a great, I don't know, who have reigned their particular period, right? So शेक्सपियरनी आपला काळ गाजवला आहे, मिल्टनने आपला काळ गाजवला आहे, डांटे आणि होमरने त्यांच्या काळामध्ये अतिशय उत्तम दर्जाचं लिटरेचर प्रोड्यूस केलं आहे. त्यामुळे अशा ग्रेट लोकांना रेफर करण्यामध्ये कुठलाही हेजिटन्स नसावा. त्यामुळे त्यांना फ्रीली अगदी म्हणजे विदाउट एनी हेजिटन्स वी मस्ट अप्रोच देम अँड रेफर टू देम, वॉज काइंड ऑफ अ थॉट दॅट वी फाइंड हिम स्प्रेडिंग इन द टच स्टोन मेथड. एक्झॅक्टली. आता हे करत असताना खरं तर बऱ्याच जणांनी त्याला क्रिटिसाइज केलं होतं की तुम्ही इंडिव्हिज्युअल टॅलेंटला डिनाय करताय का मग. तर असं काही नाहीये. त्याने सांगितलं की इंडिव्हिज्युअल टॅलेंट आहेच, पण इंडिव्हिज्युअल टॅलेंटला अजून शेप आणण्यासाठी काय महत्वाचं आहे तर जे क्लासिकल आहे किंवा जे उत्तम आहे, क्लासिकल इथे उत्तम या शब्दाने घेऊया, द बेस्ट या पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने घेऊयात, राईट. सो इट इज मच मोर इम्पॉर्टंट टू रेफर टू द बेस्ट आउट ऑफ ऑल, राईट. सो हे सगळ्यात महत्वाचं आहे. अशा प्रकारचं ओपिनियन इकडे करताना दिसतो. So the critical legacy lies in making criticism a serious intellectual pursuit, combining moral insight with discipline evaluation. Then we have again one of the prominent figure. आता हे पहिले तीन म्हणजे बघा, थॉमस कार्लाइल, जॉन रस्किन आणि मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्ड हे काही बाबतीमध्ये मटेरियलिस्टिक सोसायटी डिनाऊन्स करताना दिसतात. एक्झॅक्टली सोललेस मेकॅनाइज्ड बिहेवियरला डिनाऊन्स करताना दिसतात, डिफेम करताना दिसतात किंवा सिव्हिअरली क्रिटिसाइज करताना दिसतात. आणि त्यामुळे मॉरल कन्सर्न, कॉशियसनेस, मॉरल कन्सर्न आणि कन्सायन्स या गोष्टीवरती जास्त भर देताना दिसतात, राईट. नाव वी हॅव गॉट अनदर प्रॉमिनंट फिगर who stands a bit different from the previous three that we have discussed so far is Walter Pater. Okay, Walter Pater काय म्हणतोय बघा, he is, he argued that art exists for its own sake and not for moral instruction. Exactly, he promoted the aesthetic individualism, and so in his Renaissance, he redefined the purpose of criticism as the cultivation of refined sensibility and पर्सनल एक्सपिरियन्स. एक्झॅक्टली, त्यामुळे क्रिटिसिझम हे काय आहे तर रिफाईंड सेन्सिबिलिटी आहे आणि पर्सनल एक्सपिरियन्सचा भाग आहे. त्यातून जे क्वालिटी वाटते ते लोकांसमोर मांडलं पाहिजे. उगीच त्याला मॉरलिस्टिक, मॉरलिस्टिक, एथिकल, एक्झॅक्टली, किंवा व्हॅल्यू ॲडेड अशा प्रकारच्या गोष्टी म्हणजे नैतिक जबाबदाऱ्यांच्या ओझ्याखाली घालायचं नाही, असं त्याचं म्हणणं होतं क्रिटिसिझमचं. आणि म्हणून जी आर्ट प्रोड्यूस केली जाते, इट्स अ प्रायमरी फंक्शन इज आर्ट फॉर आर्ट सेक. Exactly was kind of a thought that he greatly propagated through his criticism, right? And so to burn always with hard gem like a flame to maintain his own. Exactly. And so his aestheticism paved the way for Oscar Wilde, and the art for art's sake became a kind of a great movement, and it replaced Arnold's moral objectivity with the subjective response of the sensitive individual. Exactly. And for Peter, what is beauty? Beauty is its own justification, and the criticism that becomes an act of artistic sympathy rather than moral instruction. So क्रिटिसिझमचं काम हे मॉरल इन्स्ट्रक्शन नाही आहे, तर आर्टिस्टिक सिम्पथीने तो ॲस्थेटिक सेन्स डेव्हलप करणं आहे, आणि त्या ॲस्थेटिक सेन्सने लिटरेचर रीड करणं आहे किंवा त्याची डिलाइटमेंट एक्सपिरियन्स करणं आहे. ओके, so what's kind of a thought we find over here. Then we have another prominent figure with a great philosophical notion is John Stuart Mill, okay, who plays a kind of a greater role in case of understanding the Victorian ideas. Right now, we again find defining poetry very particularly in his essay "What is Poetry" that got published in 1833 particularly. So when we try to understand the work of those people, हे सगळे एकमेकांना एकदम कंटेम्पररी आहेत बरं का. म्हणजे अक्षरशः थॉमस कार्लाइल, जॉन रस्किन, त्यानंतर परत मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्ड, वॉल्टर पॅटर आणि आता स्टुअर्ट मिल, हे सगळे एकमेकांना कसे आहेत तर एकमेकांना असे बरेचसे पूरक आहेत. आणि तो काय म्हणतोय एक्झॅक्टली, he defines poetry as a feeling of confessing itself to itself in a moments of solitude. Okay, you are alone, you have got emotions, you express those emotions, it means you confess to yourself with that solitudeness. So he says it is a feeling that confesses itself to itself in a solitude moments, right? He differentiates between eloquence and poetry, exactly, and thus his approach represents the beginning of psychological theory of literature, who focuses on inner working of the poet's mind. एक्झॅक्टली, त्यामुळे स्ट्रीम ऑफ कॉन्शियसनेसला कुठेतरी इथून आपण असं म्हणू शकतो की काइंड ऑफ बिट एक ट्रिगर मिळाला किंवा स्टिम्युलंट मिळाला. एक्झॅक्टली, वेरॅज इनर थॉट किंवा पुढचा अजून एक पार्ट म्हणजे कुठला तर ड्रामॅटिक मोनोलॉग. एक्झॅक्टली, हा एक पार्ट आहे की ऑडियन्सला तिथे ऑलरेडी प्रेझेंट आहे असं कन्सिडर करून. विक्टोरियन एरामध्ये रॉबर्ट ब्राउनिंगनी पॉप्युलर केलेला पार्ट कुठला असेल तर तो आहे ड्रामॅटिक मोनोलॉग. एक्झॅक्टली, अँड दस इट इज मच मोर इम्पॉर्टंट टू अंडरस्टँड हॅव दॅट. याच्यावरती प्रश्न येतो म्हणजे हमखास येतो. So we have to keep in mind about those certain factors too, right? Now after John Stuart Mill, we have the next prominent figure is George Henry Lewis, who is famous for his scientific criticism. Exactly, who is a contemporary to George Eliot and advocated an empirical rational approach to literature. Exactly, In his work, The Principles of Success in Literature, we find him arguing that criticism should be based on observation and analysis and not on vague enthusiasm or moralizing. म्हणजे काय तर बघा पुढचे येणारे आता यामध्ये आपण टोटल 7 लोकांना अनुभवतोय. 7 मधले पहिले 3 ते 4 म्हणजे मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्ड पर्यंत असं सांगतायत. काय सांगतायत? मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्ड पर्यंत जी लोक आहेत ते असं सांगतायत की क्रिटिक्सचं काम हे एज्युकेटर म्हणून आहे, प्रॉफिट म्हणून आहे, मॉरल गाईड म्हणून आहे, वगैरे वगैरे आहे, राईट. बट now we have got those people who are bit opposite with what they are trying to say over here, exactly. And so we find him defining the role of critic, that is observation and analysis, and not vague enthusiasm or moralization, exactly. Directional, your enthusiasm should have a direction, vague नको आहे, exactly. You are complete, not under the possession of moralization of the literary work, exactly. Your thought ने पण नको आहे, exactly. So it should be a observation and analysis. Okay, it should be based on observation and analysis, and thus we find him literature, treating literature as a branch of human knowledge, subject to laws of expression and perception. Exactly. So, what is literature according to him? According to George Henry Lewis, exactly, G.H. Lewis, it is a branch of human knowledge and also a subject to laws of expression and perception. And thus, according to him, the scientific temper anticipated the objective criticism of later figures like T.S. Eliot and the new critics. Thus, because of this only, because of those many people only, we can see this Victorian period can be seen keeping a proper balance between the romantic ideas, okay, and in a way creating a platform for modern literature, exactly. मॉडर्न लिटरेचरला एका मॉडर्न लिटरेचरला आपला प्लॅटफॉर्म तयार करून देणं आणि त्यासोबतच रोमॅन्टिक आयडियाजला पण पुढे घेऊन जाणं या प्रकारचं कंबाईन काम करताना आपल्याला हा भाग दिसतो. लाईक आफ्टर हिम वी हॅव Leslie Stephen, who is considered as a historical and who is famous for his historical and ethical criticism. Otherwise, right? Yes, he is the editor of Dictionary of National Biography, who approached literature historically and ethically. He viewed literature as an expression of moral evolution of society, an idea later refined by F.R. Lewis. And his work marks the movement of criticism towards literary history as a field of discipline study. Exactly. So, literary history वरती फेमस आहे त्यामुळे हिस्टॉरिकल आणि इथिकल क्रिटिसिझम वरती सगळ्यात जास्त फोकस दिसतो. एक्झॅक्टली. आणि म्हणूनच त्यानं त्याच्या कामामध्ये मॉरल इव्होल्युशनला सोसायटीच्या मॉरल इव्होल्युशनला सिग्निफिकन्स दिलेला आहे आणि लिटररी क्रिटिसिझम हे त्याच्यासाठीच काम करणारं असावं. एक्झॅक्टली. अ काइंड ऑफ अ सिमिलर थॉट वी फाइंड हिम in a way providing over here, and so his works remains of a otherwise a greater significance. So it is much more important to understand the works of those. Okay, so till now we have seen the prominent figures particularly who have played a kind of a great role otherwise in case of understanding literature in a way, right? And which are these figures? It is much more of an importance to understand which are these figures who have played a great role. Exactly. Initially we have a Thomas Carlyle, exactly. Then we have John Ruskin, then we have Matthew Arnold, then we have John Stuart Mill, then we have Walter Petter, exactly. Then we have this George Henry Lewis, and then we have Leslie Stephen, exactly. These are the 7 figures who are prominent, who are considered the prominent critics particularly, who have made an impactful contribution in the field of literary criticism in Victorian era, and thus it is much more important to understand their work. Now let us go and try to understand some general characteristics of the Victorian criticism. Exactly. One of the prominent characteristics of Victorian criticism is its a moral seriousness. Exactly. So we find that the Victorian critics that they have seen literature as a moral instrument, exactly a tool to spread morality aware people about morality and awaken the society with certain moral values. Exactly. And thus the criticism has seen literature as a capable for guiding the society towards truth and goodness. Exactly. And so developing the quality of conscience uh, can be seen with the literature that got produced. And so there was a little tolerance for art that was merely decorative or amoral. Amoral means which is not moralistic. Exactly. So the art that is not having a purpose to spread the moralistic values or ethical values in society, or which would lack you know the which would be more of a decorative rather. Exactly, but lacking the moral qualities would be hardly tolerated. एक्झॅक्टली. त्यामुळे मग मोठ्या प्रमाणामध्ये आर्ट, कुठलाही आर्ट असू दे, मग ते पेंटिंग असो, ड्रॉइंग असो, पोएट्री असो, लिटरेचर असो, whatever it would be considered as one of the prominent figure, right? But that would be also cheering up to lead the moral society. Didactic purpose. Exactly, when we try to understand the role of Victorian criticism, exactly, it's aimed particularly to instruct. That means to teach the society and not just to delight. Exactly, and that's why I'm repeating for several times that how uh, the role of literature makes kind of a greater impact in case of understanding that, and thus it takes us back to what Aristotle and Plato had stated. Exactly. So if you remember in the previous lecture, I had given this very simple example to you about Plato's idea of ideal state, in which he said that poet is nothing but a mere imitation, and so he had no place for poets in his ideal state, where he said that the observance of truth or finding the truth is done based on a reason and logical reasoning and great amount of turmoil. But whereas poetry or any form of literature or art is just nothing but a mere imitation, right? A kind of thought we can be conceived, but in the same way, we find them stating that the major function of literature is not just to delight, but it is to instruct. Exactly. And so the critic was a teacher of culture. Exactly. It should teach culture. It should teach culture. It should teach moral values. It should assess the literature which has a moral values or not, if it has a moral values or not. Exactly. And so it would shape the moral and intellectual life of the nation. Exactly. So he had to have that philosophical angle, spiritual angle, and that would bless him with certain amount of morality and moral conscience in a way. Otherwise, हे असणं फार महत्वाचं होतं एखाद्या critic कडे. Okay, and that's why it is one of the prominent attribute of Victorian criticism. Social consciousness. Okay, this remains again one of the significant factors. Now we can see some of the prominent critics like Carlyle or John Ruskin, who viewed literature as a deeply connected to the social reformation, and thus art could be separated from the conditions of life. Exactly. Thus, an art which exists is not for the sake of art, but for the sake of instructing the society with certain moral principles, values, and rules and regulations. Could be, this was the thought that got greatly spread by the prominent figures of Victorian age, like Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin. Exactly, search for order and culture. Exactly, amid the rapid change, industrial revolution was taking place. British Empire was getting in a way widespread. Exactly, scientific temperament was there, rationalistic approach was there. Exactly, and so societies were noticing rapid changes, and not just were in societies, but in various literature forms, subject matters, and the great urge for bringing the moral stability to the society. Exactly. With this, we find critics permanently seeking the standards, the civil standards, the best that has been thought and said. Exactly. So pursuing which is something of a greater quality can be noticed with the understanding of the period, right? So in this period, this matters the most to realize what kind of greater amount of impact can be seen with the social pressure, societal pressure, right? The transition to aestheticism. Exactly. So the later Victorians, beginning with Pater, began to question moralism, turning instead to aesthetic contemplation and subjective experience. This shift anticipates modernism's interest in form, perception and individuality. Exactly. म्हणून मी तुम्हाला म्हणलं की जेव्हा आपण मगाशी ते 7 प्रॉमिनंट फिगर्स बघितल्या, या 7 मधल्या पहिल्या ज्या 3 आहेत या काय करतायत, या मॉरल्सला व्हॅल्यू देत आहेत. एक्झॅक्टली आर्ट्स, एक्झॅक्टली आर्टचं काम काय आहे तर मॉरल लिटरेचर आहे. एक्झॅक्टली व्हॉट इज द रोल ऑफ आर्ट्स, आर्ट्स प्रॉमिनंट रोल इज मॉरल गायडिंग. ओके, आणि मग बाकीचे जे चार आहेत किंवा उरलेले जे तीन आहेत त्यांचं आपण जेव्हा काम बघतो तेव्हा ते उरलेले तीन काय सांगतायत तर उरलेले तीन हे या ॲस्थेटिझमच्या, एक्झॅक्टली आर्ट्स फॉर आर्ट्स टेकच्या, थोडंफार रूल अँड ऑर्डरला बाजूला ठेवून सब्जेक्टिव्ह एक्सपिरियन्सच्या, इंडिव्हिज्युअलिझमच्या गोष्टींच्या विचारांकडे वळताना दिसतात. Exactly, and so we find that the later Victorians, especially beginning with Peter, they began to question moralism. Exactly, एक्सेसिव्ह झालं की त्याच्यामध्ये लगेच क्वेश्चन केलं, कारण सायंटिफिक पर्स्युट आहे, अनालिटिकल माइंड आहेत, अनालिसिस आहे, त्या अनालिसिस थ्रू पडणारे प्रश्न थेट विचारण्याची पद्धत आहे. एक्झॅक्टली, अँड सो दे टर्न instead to aesthetic contemplation and subjective experience. So this shift anticipates modernism's interest in form, परसेप्शन अँड इंडिव्हिज्युअलिटी. एक्झॅक्टली, आणि म्हणून इथे जे आपण मॉडर्न पिरियडबद्दल जेव्हा आपण अभ्यास करायला जाऊ तेव्हा मॉडर्न पिरियडमधला जो अभ्यास आहे तो प्रॉमिनंटली कशावर फोकस करतो तर तो मॉडर्न पिरियडमधला जो अभ्यास आहे तो प्रॉमिनंटली या सगळ्या गोष्टींवरती अभ्यास करतो. राईट, and let's go to see the conclusion of this very period. Particularly this literary criticism, it occupies a kind of in a way a unique place in the history of English thought, right? It transformed the criticism from casual opinion into serious intellectual discipline. एक्झॅक्टली, म्हणून आपल्याकडे मॅथ्यू अर्नॉल्ड सारखे लोक आहेत की ज्यांनी त्याला प्रॉपर स्ट्रक्चरमध्ये आणलं आणि याची एक वेगळी डिसिप्लिन आहे आणि याचे एक वेगळे प्रिन्सिपल्स आहेत कशाचे, लिटररी क्रिटिसिझमचे. ओके, वी कॅन सी them promoting such a kind of a thought in a very serious way, and thus it is much of importance to understand that, right? And thus it criticized, transformed criticism into a casual open into a serious intellectual discipline, and it combined moral idealism with cultural analysis, and it gave criticism a public and educative function. Exactly, criticism is of a public and it is there to teach the public, it is there to educate the public about certain moral values and ethics. Exactly, and so from Carlyle's prophetic sermons to Peter's aesthetic reveries, respect for art, we can see Victorian criticism that reflects the age struggle to balance faith and reason. Exactly, you have a faith, you have a reason. Exactly, ethics, obviously you have to follow the ethics, and so you have to bless or appreciate the beauty. Exactly, thus your individual talent is significant, and so the society is also significant, and thus we can see it's a legacy that endures in modern conviction. Exactly, that literature is not luxury but an essential mode of understanding and shaping human life. सो लिटरेचरचा खरा उपयोग हा ह्युमन लाईफ समजून घेण्यासाठी आणि ह्युमन लाईफला एक शेपमध्ये आणण्यासाठी किंवा एका प्रॉपर आयडियल स्ट्रक्चरमध्ये आणण्यासाठी असावा, किंवा लिटरेचरचा रोल तो आहे अशा प्रकारचं एक ओपिनियन जनरेट करताना दिसतो आपला विक्टोरियन पिरियड. एक्झॅक्टली, नाउ व्हॉट, let us go and find out what Matthew Arnold has to say. Culture is the best that has been thought and said in the world. The Victorian critics believed that through culture and through literature, humanity could find both meaning and moral harmony. So, culture matters. Exactly. So, the appreciation of culture, observance of culture, and the expansion of culture across the globe can be seen greatly perceived and longed by the Victorian critics. So this was all about Victorian period of literary criticism, which remains a remarkable journey of literature from a romantic period into a Victorian period where classical ideas, classical things, moral values, social morality, social concern could be greatly raised, and which laid a foundation to the modern thoughts. Exactly. So, based on that, we can see the 20th century modern literature and the criticism that got greatly popularized in modern period. Right. Our next part that we are going to discuss is none other than the modern period of literature. But prior to that, let us conclude our today's session on this. See, after that we are going to see question answers. But prior to that, let's take a break for 5 minutes. the various significant factors of Victorian period. Let me revise you what we have talked in this Victorian period before we move to understand the question answers right away. Right. So we have talked about the major factors uh, that shaped the that shaped the period exactly. Then we talked about prominent critics, right? And then we talked about the characteristics of Victorian period, right? So we have talked about these prominent factors. Now we talked about the Victorian period that was there from 18th to 19th century, basically the first half of 19th century, and the full 20th century and full 19th century can be greatly noticed over here. And thus it remains a kind of a remarkable factor, particularly to understand that. Exactly, there are several decades, okay, that we have been through. So we had talked about various major factors who which play a kind of a great amount of role in case of shaping the period, right? Industrialization, mechanization, scientific pursuit, and rationalism, and expansion of British Empire are the factors that shaped the Victorian period, the criticism of Victorian period particularly, right? So we are talking about major factors that shaped the criticism of this very particular period. Then we talked about some prominent critics like Thomas Carlyle, John, and then John Nichol. Then we have got Matthew Arnold with us. Then we have got John Stuart Mill, exactly. Then we have got Lewis, exactly. And so there are a few of the other prominent figures that we have talked, right? And then we have seen what are the various characteristics of the Victorian criticism, particularly, right? The criticism in Victorian period. Now, after that, after discussing those many factors about this, uh, let us go to solve the question and answers, and also let's go to see their various explanations exactly. Now these are the MCQs that are kept with keeping your net and set exams in front of our vision, right? आपल्या नेट आणि सेट परीक्षांना समोरून आपण काही प्रश्नोत्तर तयार केलेले आहेत. त्या प्रश्नोत्तराचे एक्सप्लेनेशन्स आहेत ते आपण आता बघणार आहोत. त्यामध्ये लक्षात असू द्या. लेट्स गो अँड स्टार्ट डिस्कसिंग अबाउट those questions. So we have got around 50 MCQs that cover the Victorian period, particularly literary criticism and the various theories that got developed. Now the question we have very first with us: which of the following critics is often called the father of modern English criticism? A very important question, keeping in mind exactly father of modern criticism: John Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, Thomas Carlyle. It is Matthew Arnold, exactly. Why? Because he systemized the criticism as a discipline through essays like The Function of Criticism at the Present Time and The Study of Poetry, where he emphasized the objectivity and culture, particularly, right? And thus, John, it's not John Ruskin or it's not Thomas Carlyle or Walter Pater, but it's Matthew Arnold, who is considered as the father of modern English criticism, right? Next to him, then further question we have with us is the function of criticism at the present time. Arnold defines criticism as, exactly, we have got his essay, right? And we find him exactly the function of criticism at the present time. It is a work where he defines criticism as the art of judging books by moral students. No, a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. Exactly, the imaginative certain creation of literature or the moral interpretation. No, the answer B is the correct answer of this question. Why? Because it is a hallmark phrase that describes criticism as a disinterested and intellectual devoted to discovering truth and not personal bias. Now, when we studied about the contribution of Matthew Arnold, there only we have seen where he talked about being disinterested. Exactly, this factor was there in the description that we read. Exactly, काय असतं पाहिजे disinterested असतं म्हणजे काय free from all sort of prejudices. Exactly, and rather we can say bias. Exactly, कुठल्याही bias मध्ये नसावं, या सगळ्यांपासून फ्री असणारं असं एक क्रिटिसिझम त्याला एक्सपेक्टेड आहे आणि म्हणून तो यामध्ये तो क्वेश्चन करतो, राईट. अँड सो द राईट आन्सर इज अ डिसइंटरेस्टेड एंडेवर टू लर्न अँड propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. Exactly. Let's move to the third question we have. Yes, poetry is a bottom, a criticism of life. Exactly. Poetry as a bottom of a criticism of life. Who said this? Exactly. And it was again stated by Matthew Arnold. Exactly. See, people, Matthew Arnold remains a kind of a prominent figure of Victorian era. So when you try to talk about Victorian era, exactly, Matthew Arnold and especially we can see Walter Pater, they remain inseparable part, particularly because they are the two different extent, or they are the two different extremes of this Victorian period who have propagated their own different identities. One is possessing with art and aestheticism, whereas the other is focusing art, culture, and its moral values. So they are the two prominent figures that are very much important. So from the study of poetry, he believed poetry offers moral and spiritual insights akin to religion, like religion. So poetry is a bottom. Poetry is at a bottom a criticism of life. Was a statement made by him. The fourth question we have is, what is Arnold's touchstone method? Exactly. Again, as I stated while explaining about Arnold's work, exactly this phrase has got greater amount of importance. Okay, touchstone method हा प्रकार फार मोठा आहे. Evaluating literature using classical quotations as standards, judging works through emotional impact, no. Exactly, assessing poetry by popularity, no. Comparing poets' lives, no. But rather it is exactly standards, quotations as a standard. So he suggested comparing modern poetry with touchstones from great masters like Homer or Dante to establish objective excellence. Exactly. And so when you have produced your work, you need to know which work is much of importance, and accordingly you need to compare it with the classical works. So he has referred, he has given a list of people. Now this is not a kind of a mandatory list, but he has got some examples in front of us to whom one can refer while producing the modern poetry. So he talked about Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton are the prominent figures that he recommended should be referred in case of getting the objective excellency, right? So option A is correct, where he states the touchstone method. Let's go to the next question we have. Which Victorian critic wrote Culture and Anarchy? And it was none other than Matthew Arnold. Exactly. So the function of criticism in the present time, Culture and Anarchy, and the study of poetry are the three prominent works that are produced by him. Exactly. And so his book presents culture as a moral ideal to harmonize, exactly what to harmonize intellect and conduct, countering the materialism and anarchy. Exactly. So in his work, this Culture and Anarchy particularly, that got produced in 1869 prominently, where he exactly propagates and appreciates culture for its better function, and in a way denounces anarchy, right? How anarchy and materialism has led to the degradation of society was kind of a thought we find him spreading over here. And so it is none other than Matthew Arnold who plays the kind of a great role. Next question. The phrase sweetness and light was borrowed by Arnold from Plato, Homer, Swift, or Aristotle. It was Jonathan Swift, people, right? Swift used it in the Battle of the Books, and Arnold adopted it to express the balance of beauty and intelligence in culture. Exactly, and so define exactly that he used this very uh, famous quote, sweetness and delight, which was used by this Jonathan Swift particularly in the Battle of Books, exactly to express the balance of beauty and intelligence in culture. Exactly. So culture is beautiful, and culture is an example of intelligence too, and thus it creates kind of a balance as a opinion. Now moving to the next question we have, which critic described poetry as a feeling confession itself to itself in a moments of solitude? Yes, and that's why the interesting question otherwise. Which create which critic described poetry as a feeling confession, exactly feeling confessing itself to itself in a moments of solitude? It was not John Ruskin, rather he talked about morality. It was not even Peter, it was not even Arnold, but it was Mill, John Stuart Mill, who expressed this. And moving further, we have got exactly it was his work, What is Poetry, where he differentiates between poetry from eloquence, exactly communication, right? Then we have got next question with us. Sartar Rastaras is primarily a work of, yes, social satire, moral and spiritual allegory, literary theory, or aesthetic philosophy. It is a moral and spiritual allegory, right? And it was Carlyle's work, which is symbolically, it's a symbolic treatise on materialism and spiritual rebirth. Exactly. Now, when we see particularly, right, आता यातले काही क्वेश्चन्स आहेत ना बघा, हे खूप लॉजिकली सोडवत येतात बरं का. When you try to solve the question, exactly, you need to know the history, and so the social and historical background of the age matters the most. Exactly. So when you try to find out the attributes that shaped the criticism of Victorian era, we talked about this very factor, right? आपण याच्याबद्दल नक्की विचार केला होता बघा, तुमच्या लक्षात आला असेल तर. We had talked about this very particular factor when we talked about literature as such, right? So what it said exactly, the highly increasing industry, exactly, resulting into luxury of social life, exactly. So this luxury increase, increase in industry, exactly, somewhere, exactly, promoting materialism, exactly. And so what needed was spiritual rebirth. असं तुम्ही लॉजिकल कनेक्शन लावून याचं प्रॉपर गोष्ट होता, म्हणून काय होतं, मॉरल अँड स्पिरिच्युअल ॲलेगरी कशाबद्दल आहे, सार्थर रिसर्च, exactly. Sartre Risarthus talks about the rebirth, and Sartre talks about materialism. And so we find, this work greatly described by Carlyle in his contribution. Next question we have is, Carlyle's concept of the hero as a poet appears in Past and Present, On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic History, Sartre Resartus, or Later Day Pamphlets. Exactly. अगदी सोपं आहे. It is hero and hero worship and the heroic in the history, where he viewed poets as a moral leaders whose insights guides humanity, and it places them above philosophers. Exactly, and thus he found poets are above the philosopher, as poetry itself is above all form of art. Exactly, and this is not again a Victorian concept, rather it was inherited from the romantics. कोणाकडनं इनहेरिट केले तर ती रोमॅन्टिक्स कडून इनहेरिट केलेली आहे. सो दिस कन्सेप्ट रिमेन्स व्हेरी significant. Okay, and so the answer is option B to the Carlyle's question on concept of the hero as a poet. Okay, then next question we have is, who wrote Modern Painters? Carlyle, Peter, Ruskin, or Arnold? It was John Ruskin, and in this series, exactly, का तर याचं जर का आपण याचं काम बघितलं, रस्किनचं, जॉन रस्किन हा मोर ऑफ आर्ट पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने क्रिटिक वाटतं, माहिती आहे का, आर्टच्या पॉईंट ऑफ व्ह्यूने क्रिटिक वाटतं, ठीक आहे, कम्पेअर्ड टू लिटरेचर, राईट. हे जे पहिले दोन जे आपण बघितले ना, लिटरेचर बद्दल नाही, म्हणजे अगदी कार्लाइल, थॉमस कार्लाइल सुद्धा हा लिटररी क्रिटिकपेक्षा मॉरल क्रिटिक खूप वाटतो. आणि दुसरा जो आहे जॉन रस्किन, एक्झॅक्टली, हा सुद्धा लिटररी क्रिटिकपेक्षा आर्ट क्रिटिक खूप वाटतो ना का, त्यामुळे त्याने पेंटर, आर्किटेक्चर, स्कल्चर अशा गोष्टींबद्दल त्याच्या कॉमेंट्स आणि आर्ट फॉर्मबद्दल जास्त लिहिलेलं आहे, राईट. अँड सो ही डिफेंड्स द पेंटर टर्नर अँड आर्ग्यूज दॅट ट्रू आर्ट एक्सप्रेसेस मॉरल ट्रूथ अँड फेथफुलनेस टू नेचर. एक्झॅक्टली, दिस इज इम्पॉर्टंट. मी तुम्हाला का बोललो की हे लक्षात ठेवण्यासारखं आहे की ट्रू आर्ट expresses moral truth and faithfulness to nature, and thus it remains one of the important factor to understand the role of this particular adverbs, right. Now let's move to the next question we have with us, question number 11, which states, There is no wealth but life is a famous dictum by Matthew Arnold, Walter Pater, John Ruskin, or George Eliot. Exactly. Yes, it was stated by John Ruskin. He declares this in unto this last, linking aesthetics and ethics with social reform. Exactly. आणि त्यामुळे हे समजून घेणं फार महत्वाचं आहे. काय वाक्य बघा, there is no wealth but life. It is a famous statement by John Ruskin. Exactly. And where unto this last is his work where he links aesthetics with ethics for the social reform. And thus it is of a much more important to understand. कोण आहे? तर हा आहे जॉन रस्किन. Let us move forward and go to the 12th question we have. Which of the following best characterizes Ruskin's aesthetic principles? Art for art's sake, beauty divorced from morality, truth to nature and moral sincerity, scientific realism. Exactly. And option C is the correct one. Truth to nature and moral sincerity. Why? He believed art must reflect moral truth and respect for divine order. Right? And so this explanation is of much more important. Now going to the third question we have with us is who among these critics inspired the aesthetic movement? Exactly, it was Peter Piper, it was Walter Peter. So let's not forget again making a list of people. Yes, so when we try to find out the work by Carlyle, then John Ruskin, exactly, आणि तिसरा कोण आहे तर तो आहे आर्नॉल्ड. ओके, या तिघांचं काम हे कशाबद्दल आहे? इट इज मोर ऑफ मॉरलिटी, आर्टच्या मॉरल फॉर्म मध्ये. सॉरी. त्यानंतर जे तिघजण आहेत ते तिघजण प्रॉमिनंटली कशावर फोकस करतात तर ते तिघजण याच्यावरती फोकस करतात. एक्झॅक्टली. So Walter Pater, in his essay The Renaissance, who emphasized beauty and individual aesthetic experience, and thus he stated art for art's sake. Question number 14 we have with us, which says the closing lines of the Renaissance urge the reader to live morally, seek social reform, burn always with a heart gem like a flame, trust in religious faith. Exactly. आणि म्हणून आपण जेव्हा वॉल्टर पॅटरचं बघितलं रेनायसन्स, एक्झॅक्टली वेर ही टॉक्स अबाउट द रिबर्थ ऑर रिव्होल्युशन, एक्झॅक्टली इट इज नीदर अबाउट मॉरलिटी, कारण त्याने मॉरलिटी प्रोपोगेट केलीच नाही. सिक सोशल रिफॉर्म नाही. तो म्हणला की आर्टचं काम हे सोशल रिफॉर्म वगैरे नाही, आर्ट फॉर आर्ट सेक आहे. एक्झॅक्टली ट्रस्ट इन रिलिजियस फेथ तो तर विषय नव्हता. त्यामुळे कुठला आहे मग बर्न ऑलवेज विथ अ हार्ड जेम लाईक अ फ्लेम. And thus is the line that closes the urge for reader, right? And thus it is the hedonistic conclusion that advocates intensity of experience as the highest value. Exactly. Yes. So when you experience an art, exactly, your experience is the highest value. Exactly. The intensity किती इन डेप्थ आहे, तर किती मनाला भिडणार आहे, प्लेजरल आहे, डिलाइटफुल आहे. एक्झॅक्टली, इट्स अ ट्रू एसेन्स. इफ इट इज अँगर that you feel, what amount of anger you feel matters the most. So its intensity is of a great value, kind of opinion we find with Walter Pater making the people. And moving to the next question, question number 15. Who influenced Oscar Wilde's aesthetic philosophy the most? Who influenced Oscar Wilde's aesthetic philosophy the most? Whether it's John Ruskin? No. Arnold? No. It was Walter Pater people. Exactly. And so we have seen when we read about the contribution of Walter Pater in his particular period of time. काय केलं होतं तर त्याने त्याच्या सोशलिस्टिक आणि अस्थेटिक मुवमेंटला चालना दिली होती. तिथून ऑस्कर वाईल्डला त्याच्या एस्थेटिक फिलॉसॉफीला एक प्रकारचं स्टिम्युलेशन मिळालं. राईट. अँड सो while absorbed Peters believed that art and beauty exist independently of moral purpose. Their purpose is not to create moral awareness. It is there already. But art is for art's sake, and so beauty is something that is just part of experience and rather than of the explanation or observance of something moral. Moving further, we have a question that states, which critic emphasized the disinterested pursuit of truth? It was Matthew Arnold people. Again, we have seen, and he just insisted that must be impartial, detached from political or religious bias. This is somehow a kind of a bit moralistic thought. Exactly, as it is a moralistic thought, it can be associated with Matthew. What was Carlyle's view of industrialism? It was a mark of progress. It dehumanized the society. It strengthened the faith and it promoted. Again, as I stated, हे पहिले जे तीन आहेत ना हे सगळे कसे आहेत मॉरल व्हॅल्यूजनी काय आहेत हायली प्रमोटेड आहेत एक्झॅक्टली त्यामुळे असे काहीतरी सध्या ना डिह्युमनाइज वगैरे जे मॉरल व्हॅल्यूजचं इम्पॉर्टन्स वाढवतात राईट मटेरियलिझमचा इफेक्ट काय आहे तर डिह्युमनाइज सोसायटी झाली म्हणून मॉरलनेस असणं गरजेचं आहे हाच वाट कुठेतरी प्रमोट करणारे लोक आहेत त्यामुळं लगेच क्लिक करायचं ऑप्शन सी सो he condemned the mechanization and materialism for eroding spiritual values. Exactly काय केलं त्यांनी सगळ्या स्पिरिच्युअल व्हॅल्यूज काय केल्या डिलीट केल्या आणि त्या कुणामुळे डिलीट झाल्या तर या सगळ्या मेकनायझेशन आणि मटेरियलिझम विच वॉज द रिझल्ट ऑफ इंडस्ट्रियलायझेशन सो इंडस्ट्री जेव्हा आली तेव्हा ह्या सगळ्या गोष्टी करत गेल्या आपण हे बघितले when we try to talk about history. Moving to the further question we have, who regarded critic as a kind of a prophet or moral teacher. It was again none other than Carlyle. Exactly. सगळ्यात मोठा उल्लेख कोणी केला पेटर वॉल्टर पेटर तर अगदी रिबेलियन आहे अर्नॉल्ड टचस्टोन मध्ये सांगतो जॉन स्टुअर्ट मिल तर पोएट्रीची डेफिनेशन सांगतो मग कोण आहे हा कार्लाइल आहे तो काय म्हणतो होता की क्रिटिक इज काइंड ऑफ लाईक अ प्रॉफिट और moral teacher right and this is a kind of a famous explanation we notice from him. Moving further, the next question we have with us. Which of the following critics represents a shift from moral to aesthetic criticism? Yes, it was Walter Pater, right? So again, as I stated, there are two prominent identities, right? So far, while discussing about different era, we have talked about the seven figures. Exactly. First, through go with moral. Exactly. Then the one that defines poem. It is John Stuart Mill. And the remaining three, they go with some sort of a rebellion thought to what moral has said and promote art, the creation, exactly. So shift from moral to aesthetic criticism can be greatly experienced with what these people had to say, right? And thus it is of a much more importance to realize that, right? So this thought is of a great importance. Now moving to the next question we have with us, the idea, sorry, the idea that art should serve social reform is most closely associated with the idea that art should serve social reform is most closely associated with Ruskin, Arnold, Pater, Wilde. Yes, neither Oscar Wilde nor Pater nor even Arnold. It is Ruskin, exactly John Ruskin, who associated beauty, morality, and social justice, unlike Pater's purely aesthetic view. Exactly, and thus these are much more important to understand their contribution. Now we have a question number 21 who says, who wrote the principle of success in literature? It is none other than George Henry Lewis, who talked about the principles of success in literature. Exactly. It was not Leslie Stephen, it was not even John Stuart Mill, or not even Matthew Arnold, but it was George Henry Lewis. Exactly. He approached criticism scientifically, emphasizing the observation and form of expression. And so it is of a great importance to understand the contribution. Right? The question number 21 we have with us is, what did Arnold mean by Philistinism? Philistinism, these were the middle class people lacking cultural refinement, Arnold's term of reproach. Exactly. So what does that mean? It means materialistic middle class mentality. Philistinism. Yes, Philistinism. Again, this question remains again an important one in case of understanding the Netflix. It is not not even romantic idealism, not even religious hypocrisy, not even political conservation, but where the middle class people lacking cultural refinement as they were greatly obsessed with materialistic and middle class mentality. Exactly, finding the uttermost truth in luxury. Exactly, excessive access of luxury, comfort that was greatly less due to the industrialization and collection of extreme capital. Right? Let's move to the next question we have with us. Who wrote Unto This Last? Yes, and it was John Ruskin who wrote this Unto This Last. Exactly, it was written in 1860. Critics industrial capitalism and promotes ethical economics into the last. For Peter, the highest aim of life is moral perfection, no. Scientific discovery, no. Intensity of experience, yes. And religious salvation, no. So, highest aim of life is intensity of experience. And so, he stated the aesthetic values and the aestheticism, right, based on that. And so, he celebrates. That's why the aestheticism celebrates intense momentary experience as the essence of life. When you read the literature, the kind of feelings you get around with it are they are not going to teach you something kind of moral, right? You have got a moral principle books that will tell you with all this kind of a thought you can see well spread by him. He is right. In question number 25 we have with us is Arnold's Hellenism and Hebraism represent. Again, they are from his textbook Culture and Anarchy, by the way. Okay, and it means, this one is something that means intellectual and beauty, and the other one it means order or obedience and morality. Exactly. So it is not political ideology or the two elements of culture and intellectual morality. Greek Hebraism, no. Rather, it is option B that goes with this intellectual and morality. Exactly. So this is from culture and anarchy, Hellenism and Hebraism. Hebraism. Next one, question number 26 we have with us. We are going to do as many questions as possible we have today. Okay, there are some 25 questions that we are yet to do from the Augustine period yet, and now remaining 20 questions from this period, which we will try to cover in our upcoming lecture series for sure. Who first applied the term aesthetic movement? Ruskin, Peter, Swinburne? No, it was Wilde. It was Oscar Wilde who popularized the term, but was philosophically rooted in Peter's thought. Exactly. Yes. So the stimulant is, याचा stimulant कोण आहे तर तो none other than it is Walter Peter. Exactly. In a way, who you can say motivated. तर कुणाला मोटिवेट केलं तर त्याने मोटिवेट केलं ऑस्कर वाईल्डला. कुणाला मोटिवेट केलं तर ऑस्कर वाईल्ड who got greatly motivated exactly from Walter Peter. Exactly, and so he popularized the term. Let us go to the question number 27 we have with us. Which critic saw literature as a branch of human science? Exactly. Which critic saw? It was George Henry Lewes. Exactly. He applied empirical methods to literature. What he did? He applied empirical methods, aligning it with scientific study. Exactly. So, he is a critic who saw literature as a branch of human science. Then we have with us who edited the Dictionary of National Biography. Exactly, and it was Leslie Stephen people. Okay, while reading about his contribution, we have seen that the Dictionary of National Biography was edited by Leslie Stephen, and his work reflects the ethical and contextual criticism. Exactly. So don't forget to read the explanations too that I have already, I'm showcasing over here, as they are also quite important people otherwise, right? त्याच्यामध्ये जे मी एक्सप्लेनेशन ऍड करतो ना ते सुद्धा वाचायला विसरू नका, कारण त्याच्यामध्ये येणारे क्वेश्चन हे मोस्टली या याच्यावरती पण आधारित असतात. एक्झॅक्टली. सो व्हेन आय स्टेट दिस, who edited the Dictionary of National Biography? It is Ruskin? No, right? Now let us go to the next question we have with us. The book Heroes and Hero Worship was published in. exactly हे फार महत्वाचं आहे, right? And it was published in 1837, 1841, 1845, 1850. हे कोणाचं आहे? हे सगळ्यात आहे. It was in 1841 people. So the book Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic History is outlined the Carlyle's great theory of the great theory of men shaping history, right? And the last question for our today's session: which critic saw art as a revelation of moral and spiritual truth? Which critic saw art as a revelation? And it was John Ruskin. In his opinion, art criticism united moral, aesthetic, and religious values. Exactly. So, guys, we have been talking about romantic period from a period actually, right? And now we have started with the MCQ questions and answers, and they are purely based on Victorian period, right? So, to conclude our today's session, exactly, uh, let me revise you what we have been discussing so far, people. So, in our today's session, we have seen a brief, a very short history of romantic period. How romantic period made an impact and laid a foundation to the thought process that got conceived in Victorian period. Not just conceived, but got widespread otherwise. Exactly, and thus Victorian period remains a remarkable incident in history, a remarkable time span in history of English literature, which has laid a foundation to the various modern thought, exactly, and which also has created some fabulous critics like Matthew Arnold, then Thomas Carlyle, Walter Pater, exactly, who have motivated, who had motivated to various movements in the further part of the literature, right? And so we also have seen that all the final seven critics. We also have seen the major factors that shaped the literary criticism in Victorian age, and also we have seen prominent critics. Also, we have seen the major factors that are the characteristics of Victorian age, right? And now we also have seen certain questions according to the net set examination, right? Keeping those examination into our vision, right? We have discussed 30 questions so far, remaining 20 questions, and some questions from Augustine period will be discussed in our upcoming lecture series. Till then, stay continued and have a very happy evening otherwise. Thank you, people.